company, and she is resident manager also for Madagascar Oil. So she has experience in both oil and mining. She is also a member of Madagascar's Chamber of Mines and a member of EITI Madagascar. So we have a very diverse panel here. So starting with Ms. Delgama, I have a couple of questions for you. Could you give us here some examples of how local citizens have been able to participate in oversight of the sector in Mongolia? And has that been easygoing, or have there been any challenges in that?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and Mongolia, just a brief that Mongolia has the very big world-ranked mining project in South Gobi, and also there is a coal mines and also gold, small and medium extractives. But Mongolia has been implementing EITI for the last 12 years, and we are recently focused on especially this subnational transparency to ensure the citizens' oversight on this industry. So the government of Mongolia ensured through this government resolution that they should establish tripartite council in the subnational summits at district level to hear the local herders, the opinions and their priorities. And there is the policy we have that the citizens can organize this council and set the meeting, organize the quarterly meetings. And besides this EITI resolution, government resolution, there's also some other ways that company-driven, that grievance mechanisms that they can work with the herders to solve the problems and work together. And outside of the EITI, there is a general administration law in Mongolia that in case of the social or environmental impact for the local communities, the companies have to organize the public hearings in each district. And there is a law. So we established 14 sub-councils in Mongolia, and we usually annually organize open days and tripartite meetings. But there was some areas are very driver is our civil society organizations, which is on the Publisher to Pay coalition. They come to the countryside and rural area and organize all those events and knowledge sharing events. But the main challenge was, for your question, we are now lessons learned that all process was like not demand driven. We are just communicated what we have available information within the EITI standard, and not actually demand driven. And that's why last 4 and 3 years, we piloted a very big communications project in 5 areas. And we say that, oh, this is the tax paid, and this is the social expenditures, what companies paid in your local community. But the gap was, their demand was quite different. So IFC, that's why they recently launched this new From Disclosure to Development program to understand what kind of information they need and where is the gap and how to promote this data usage. So our findings was our local herders, as a herder, they want to know the procurement information, how much product they can supply for the companies. But also the challenge in Mongolia is due to the barriers of this poor infrastructure development, to ensure this herders' participation, this council was difficult. At least they are living offline and not actively, saw this advertisement on social media or website. That's why it was quite, these barriers of the infrastructure was limited our efforts. And the third thing is it was the difficulties related to the intermediaries. For example, there is information, but the information interpreters we call intermediaries was not actively used the available data sets. For example, local governments, academia, think tanks, or civil society people were more interested in mining, but not to use it as open data sets in order to understand these, all these numbers. So for short, we have there's a good policies and good examples of this to ensure this local herders' voice in the sector. But the main challenge was all related to the data sets, which is aggregated, missing very contextual information, and we are missing very detailed information, for example, on water or sectoral information and procurement. So it's not the build capacity of the intermediaries to use this data, and also to promote subnational transparency, to disclose more demand-driven, more citizens-focused information under EITI.
That's very interesting. So, yes, what kind of information are Gobi pastoralist herders who look after their livestock really interested in? Most of them without access to cell phone, and not really interested in aggregate data, but wondering how this is going to affect the water that their livestock need, and what is the local procurement, and whether that will be helpful for them in their own livelihoods. And of course, IFC has a very good grievance mechanism, and indeed an NGO worked with the Gobi herders at their request to bring a grievance to the Ombudsman of the World Bank, which encouraged then tripartite dialogue and this very constructive and positive process with more expert communications looking at demands, citizen demands for what information they wanted. And so I have just a quick further question. And what opportunities has the sector brought then to the communities affected by mining in Mongolia? And would you say any of this has lessons for other countries?
Of course, before I go and answer your second question, I just forgot to mention that the trust issue was very also difficult in Mongolia, because the herders don't believe, at the moment it's being very difficult to trust which company has communicated. They are always having the question mark, are these numbers are correct or credible? So that's why in the Mongolian case, it's important to build the third and independent institution in the sector to communicate these credible EITI disclosed numbers to the community. That's why I'm just because of this trust issue, is all our efforts is decreasing. So I wanted to show this infographic that we visualized during our IFC organized data capacity building, and of course, obviously, Mongolian mining sector is contributing very huge in our GDP and income. We are very, this 90% of our export is from the mining, and the GDP is 30%. And as you see, these local communities are receiving these social expenditures to build the schools and roads. And there's a very good examples, but these good examples are always being under the hidden of this populistic view of points. And I think there is lots of good examples, but it's not actively communicated. So we can see that because of these extra sheets of these numbers are not effectively communicated, but we are trying to build, next slide please, to show this, how people, this minor sector is communicating. You see these numbers that the OT South Gobi area is quite, actively increased the GDP because of this mining, industry. You see this orange one. No. Yeah, the third one is it's quickly visualized that it's there at level South Gobi, this economic quite doubled the GDP after this mining industry. So there's lots of good examples, but it's not actively communicated within the community, and always talking about the first negative impacts, and always some our areas always calling that, especially to call them like non-mining free province or etc.
Okay, yes, very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we'll see what the plenary will ask you about that. But meanwhile, from the airport, just to remind you, Eda Müller is the chair of Transparency International in Germany, has worked previously on climate policy, and some time back, as I mentioned, as a government minister, interestingly, for one of the 16 states of Germany, and in Germany, each state has its own parliament as well as its own government system. So welcome, Dr. Eda. And one of the questions that I have for you is the multi-stakeholder group of EITI Germany has been compiling a lot of information on water usage and tax and energy, renewable energy as well. And I wondered what lessons you've learned in the process in terms of citizen participation and use of this information.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and I'm really sorry to be delayed. Let me first thank the organizers. We are very happy, and I can say this on behalf of the civil society group and also the entire MSG multi-stakeholder group in Germany, that you have put the social and environmental implications and impact of EITI on the agenda today. Because you asked me the question why we put this information into our report. We had a long discussion about what matters in Germany concerning extractive industries' activities. And so from the very beginning, we thought that the transparency of economic and financial transactions are not enough, but mainly for the local citizens, the environmental and the social impact is of very high importance. So we discussed that first of all, we should include environmental aspects in our report. And so we started and we had an intensive discussion about that, by including the state of art of renewables in Germany, because this is our main climate change activity. So it's one of the environmental issues that we have to tackle. And secondly, we thought that we also have to go into social aspects, but I come to that a little later. So our main idea is that local citizens, on one hand, they are certainly interested in the economic and financial aspects, because that means jobs, that means local tax income. So this is very important, but on the other hand, also the impact on environment and social aspect is important. So what we did so far, we addressed the, well, it's more or less at the first of our legal obligations. In Germany, extractive industry has to comply with. And this means they have to comply with our nature conservation law, which means that all activities that are done by these countries have to follow three principles. First of all, they have to minimize the impact on the environment. And secondly, they have to go into compensation. And compensation can be done in kind. That means that they can plant trees, they can buy some landscape where they protect the nature. And finally, if these both possibilities are not possible, they have to pay some money, so it's in kind or in money that this kind of compensation has to be done. Other information concerning the environmental impact regarding environmental protection deal with regulations that have to be taken into account, such as the building and water resources management law, which is one environmental aspect which is really of high importance when you go into extraction, and secondly, the Federal Emission Control Act. While most industrial activities have to comply with these environmental obligations, so it's nothing special for extractive industries, the mining sector and that's what we are talking about, the mining sector has additional obligations, such as financial provisions for recultivation measures, and after closure, for instance, of a mine, this is for hard coal, and very soon we certainly also will go into this problem when we close our lignite mining. Measures for the after closure of the mine, the companies have to ensure that they will go into, they have to pay for measures for rehabilitation, so that again there can be some activity, and final recultivation, and also security issues, because you cannot leave these mines without any protection in the next, sometimes over centuries. Very important for citizens and for the local population is information concerning subsidies, we thought. So we are not looking only into the one-way financial stream, which means companies who pay to the tax authorities, but also what the state pays in subsidies to help certain industrial activities. The most important subsidy in the German mining industry in the past were subsidies in the hard coal sector, when Germany decided to phase out hard coal mining. The main political intention was to help adaptation to the economical and social decline of an entire region, mainly the Ruhr region. The Ruhr region, and after the Second World War in Germany, was the most prosperous region in Germany. But when they phased out coal, they came into social economical problem. So they decided, the state, the federal state, and also the state, the North Rhine-Westphalia, to help to adapt the transfer from a coal mining region and steel also region to a region where a new industry and modern other industry branches have to put up. These subsidies have been phased out now. They're stopped. There's some rest for the for mainly for social purposes, but mainly this has come to an end. But we shall very soon face a similar regional problem when we shall phase out lignite and close the existing open-cast lignite mines in two regions in Germany, one in the east and one in the western part of Germany. So the government decided, they have not formally, but they had a commission, and now it seems to be clear that we will phase out lignite mining the latest in 2038 because of climate change activity and objectives. Local reactions now, that's what you asked me, local reactions concerning these kind of activities have two phases always. On the one hand, the fear of workers and their families to lose their jobs. This is now a big debate, mainly in the eastern region, where lignite, a discussion of phasing out lignite has started, and we have elections there after the summer holidays, and so we have to see what this come out. So, and the other thing is the environmental concern by activists who would like to stop immediately lignite extraction, and also they would like to avoid that any further resettlements should take place. So this, I think, is very clear that you have, from a local point of view, you always have two concerns. One is the economic and financial, and the other is the environmental, and then also social. Let me only finish by saying that we now, for the second report, which we prepare now in our multi-stakeholder group, we will look more closely to the social implications. And I can say that here two things are of real very high importance. We have a special situation in mining industry that unions, labor unions, always were very strong. And so the social conditions here are very strong also for protection of the security issues. And they also have a voice to say in all planning activities. The decision of how the lignite, for instance, extraction took place, all these things are very much, let's say, discussed together with local people and also with the unions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this reminds me, as a small child, I was brought up in the Welsh coal mining valleys, and I remember, you know, I have relations who lost their jobs when Margaret Thatcher in UK probably did not have such a wonderful MSG EITI process with real negotiation skills, which is handling many different citizen stakeholder views, environment, social, economic, and a just transition for both the younger generations worried about climate and union workers worried about their families and their jobs. So thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be questions about that and many lessons for other countries. So moving on to Honorable Eduardo Guevara, Vice Minister of Peru. So Peru has established also subnational local EITI processes in different provinces or regions. Arequipa, Apurimac, which is famous for the Las Bambas communities and conflicts, Loreto, Moqueca, etc. So in particular, we're very interested to hear from you how local citizens have made use of the information and of revenues, and what you have learned from that.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Regarding EITI at the subnational level, we've had a very interesting experience in Peru. First, we started at the national level. Yes, can you hear the interpretation? Channel 1 for English, channel 1 for English. Yes? Okay. I wanted to comment on the EITI process at the subnational level in Peru. Obviously, we started at the national level in 2011, and as of 2013, we started working at the subnational level in these 5 regions: Arequipa, Apurimac, Loreto, Moquegua, and Piura. These are regions where we have mining and hydrocarbon-based activities. And this is fundamental because we are very interested in making this knowledge transferable, meaning the data the businesses are providing to local governments, and then make sure the local governments can pass this on to the national government so that everyone can verify what the expenditures are being used for, namely in these mining regions. And we believe that this is very interesting because it will provide for clear information and allow us to monitor the way these funds are being spent. Now, indeed, in some cases, we know that we still have to work harder on this data because even though we do have available data, we need to reach our population better and convey this information so that they can use the information, because we have noted that sometimes there are social conflicts even though they have resources and they're not being used properly, especially by regional governments. Regional governments should be using this income to cover some of the social gaps in these regions where we have mining activities in our country. The issue is that when there is a social conflict and when we start engaging with the civil society and local communities about the issues, we've realized that often local and regional governments aren't using these funds properly. Unfortunately, this is sometimes due to corruption, but it's also due to a lack of properly trained staff for them to design projects that will help cover the social gaps, whether sewage, water, access to electricity, health, or education. These are basic needs for all of our population, and too often we have noticed that this leads to social conflict, and of course there are the environmental issues that lead to many conflicts, but more specifically when we engage with some of the regions and some of the local communities in conflict, when we look at the information we have, thanks to the data that is transferred to local governments, well, we've realized that the funds are there, but the issue is earmarking these funds for the local population and making sure that they benefit from them. And this means that we have realized we need to work on outreach. And it's not just having free open information, because at the national and subnational level we have available information, and the data is on a website which is the EITI website for Peru. But we need to reach the communities where the mining companies operate and make sure that the information is passed on properly in a meaningful manner, so that the local community is aware of what the funds are being used for and can monitor the use of these funds by local and regional authorities.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And can I just ask you, I mean, you've mentioned the need for the local governments to both have more capacity as well as be more transparent about how they are investing these resources for the benefit of the local citizens. Can you say a bit about, are there specific village funds or financial mechanisms which dedicate resources to and channel resources specifically, the mining resources specifically to local communities? That's one question. And another question is, what kind of capacity in conflict resolution did you at the federal central government level, as well as your colleagues at local government level, have to develop to resolve some of these conflicts? And did you have to bring different sectors of government together to help do that, as well as the company? Some lessons for other countries here.
De acuerdo. Voy a comenzar por la...
Well, I'll start with the second question, because this is something that we've been very proactive on recently. Actually, just last week, we worked on several of these conflicts. And indeed, if you take a closer look at these conflicts, often the issue isn't the extractive activity itself. It has to do with a lack of state presence. And the lack of state presence is something that the communities are very outspoken about when we engage in discussions with them. And it has to do with not having basic services such as access to water, electricity, education, quality health care. And unfortunately, all of these basic services aren't available for these communities, but there are resources in these communities. And that means that the state at a national and a regional level needs to mobilize, because that means when we choose to address some of these conflicts, we don't just go with the Ministry of Mines. We've been going also with the Ministry of Health, with our sanitation authorities, our education authorities, and communication authorities, because most of these communities live in the most remote areas in our country. Some of the schools aren't connected to the internet because on the one hand there is no electricity and access to communication is highly complex, but not having internet also means a limited access to health, because sometimes there is one single doctor for several villages, and if there are complex diseases, it would be a lot easier for the doctor to be able to look up information on the internet or access remote medical services. So often the conflicts have to do with the social gap, and we have to address this in a cross-cutting way at the level of national and subnational government. Now, on the first question you asked, we have social funds from mining. These are trust funds we've set up, and they are designed to channel resources directly to our communities, because whether they are royalties or business corporate income taxes, all of these taxes go straight to the state's budget, but bringing them back to the communities is complex. So often communities complain and say that they need to be able to access these funds more directly. For instance, for hydrocarbons, we have a prior consultation process, and 4 years ago, we decided that there would be a trust fund that would channel the funds from the hydrocarbon project to the local community without having to go through the whole state budget process with all the validations and earmarking it meant. We're still working on this. There are still some shortcomings we need to overcome for some of the contracts we have. Just a few days ago, we were working with people in some communities who didn't understand what was happening with the funds. So there are things we need to correct, but we are working on it, and we are striving to implement these changes so that thanks to these trust funds, we can channel the funds directly to the communities, regardless from the other income that goes straight to the state budget through royalties or corporate income taxes. And often this goes from the state budget to local government so that they can meet the local population's needs. Thank you.
The communities that see the trucks going out with mineral wealth and then don't have drinking water or water and sanitation, and then it turns into violent conflict. And here's a very good example of multi-stakeholder but multi-sectoral engagement to resolve conflicts and try and make the actual financing delivery system directly to communities more transparent by having dedicated funds. So moving on, can I ask Mr. Juan from the Inter-American Development Bank about your experience in developing some of these geospatial information in Peru and Colombia, and to what extent that's actually being used. It sounds quite high-tech.
Thank you very much, Penny. I'll also switch to Spanish. Reason, and that is that we want this message to get across Latin American countries. Así que voy a hablar en español.
So I'll be speaking Spanish because we will be discussing the issue of language in communication, and I think it is fundamental that from our side of the planet, from our region, we speak the language we communicate in with people and the language that we use as a tool every day. First of all, and very quickly, I'd like to thank the EITI Secretariat, especially Francisco, and commend him for the hard work he's done over all these years as he has been at the head of the EITI work in the Latin American region. I know it's been hard work, and he should be commended for doing so. I'd also like to commend all of my team from the Inter-American Development Bank, Mario Juan Cava, Juan Carlos, Alejandro Berron. They aren't here with me today, but I would like to thank them for their hard work. And I'd also like to thank the bank for its institutional support, and our vice president and head of division, Lea Jimenez, and the coordinator for transparency. And now I'd like to start with an anecdote. This anecdote goes back to 2014, and one of my colleagues told me about this. In a small town in the Amazon, in a very tense negotiation between local authorities and inhabitants in the impact zone of an oil project, they seem to have reached an agreement. all of the options were out on the table, and the communities decided that they would take royalties, but they didn't want oil. Royalties, yes. Oil, no. This meant that the community wanted to keep getting the benefits from the oil royalty, but they didn't want the oil to be extracted. And this does sound logical, but it's tragic because we believe this reflects the failure of the dialogue at the subnational level and all of the extractive industries. The extractive industries have huge economic, social, and environmental impacts, and this is something that goes beyond the shadow of a doubt, and it goes well beyond the different levels of government. In Latin America and the Caribbean, 50% of the planet's biodiversity must be protected, which means striking a balance between economic development and the need to preserve the environment. This means that the industry needs good practices for the execution, the prevention, and the functioning of operations such as large shifts of land, deforestation, pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, closing roads, and rehabilitating the environment, just to mention a few of these. In this context, the extractives industry needs to further enhance standards and processes to protect ecosystems. And, as Eduardo just said very clearly, we need to build the state's capacities to monitor the impact that this industry has. And let me tell you that this goes well beyond having a series of laws that protect the environment. Now, of course, we need these laws, but that's not enough. Yesterday, we published an article with Danny Kaufman and Mark Robinson where we mentioned the implementation gap of laws in the Latin American region as one of the biggest challenges for the extractive industry. Clearly, action must be taken. If we don't, there will be more conflicts, more environmental disasters, and more citizens' distrust in an industry that could contribute to improving people's living conditions. Now, the issue is, and that is why all of us are here today, how can we do this? Let me start with a few figures that will outline the context. A Watkins study in 2017 showed that the lack of transparency in these projects has to do with 68% of the conflicts we've heard of. And this 68% explains why we're sitting here. 68% means less transparency, more distrust, and more conflicts. Now, of course, there is no silver bullet, as the expression goes in English, but there are three key characteristics I'd like to lay out very quickly, and that are building blocks for a solution. First of all, we need to further the access to information and participation mechanisms for civil society. I won't discuss access to information much more because we've heard a lot about it and we'll hear more about it. But regarding participation mechanisms for civil society, I'd like to give some concrete examples. First of all, we need early onset dialogues which allows citizens to have an impact on the project's design and on how the project's externalities will be managed. Now, this isn't rocket science. This is just starting early on. Second, the players in each project need to be properly identified, and the diversity of players' opinions must always be respected. Third, there has to be transparency about interests, responsibilities, and benefits for all players involved in a project. The second issue, and this has to do with Penny's question, has to do with strengthening governance in this industry by using the new technologies, because the closest thing at hand for all of our citizens today is a smartphone. And even in the most remote areas, people have cell phones. But using data is key, not just to ensure transparency and greater accountability. Using data is key to have inputs for better policy making. The Inter-American Development Bank thinks that this is what is at stake. It's not just transparency and accountability. This is fundamental, but what we need is input for better policy making. And I'd like to give you some examples of this. For instance, in Colombia, there is a transparency platform on royalties. Now, prior to this platform, there were approximately 53 wrongdoings that were reported every year. But once the platform was online, and you can all look it up, there were 1,000 reported wrongdoings a year, not just 53. This is fundamental because it highlights how geospatial and georeferenced data and making relevant information available to citizens means more reporting of wrongdoing by citizens. And last but not least, I believe technology can be and is a major channel for enhancing information and making it more transparent. But technology won't solve all of our problems and won't mean we need to change our strategies when it comes to communication and intercultural communication. So what I want to stress here is the need to include indigenous languages. In Peru, 13% of the total population speaks Quechua, and these are figures we need to keep in mind when we design our communication strategies. Thank you very much.
To hear that the Inter-American Development Bank and the government of Peru are using not just technology about finance and revenues, but georeferenced technology. And I was very interested to meet some indigenous peoples who speak Quechua and live in quite remote areas in the Amazon and Peru. And they are also using their own technology. They're using drones to actually monitor and surveil the petroleum companies and investments that are coming into their territory. So citizens themselves are also using high tech. So I'm glad to hear that the government and the Inter-American Development Bank are catching up with some of the remote non-Spanish speaking indigenous peoples in these areas. Moving on to Miss Lydia. And come a long way, so moving from Colombia and Peru to Madagascar. And you have the company and corporate view, and I understand companies have been really very proactive and driving the EITI implementation in Madagascar, a very positive example. And I wondered whether you could explain how this has brought benefits to local stakeholders and how has this improved relationships with the companies? How do the local stakeholders perceive you as a company representative in Madagascar?
I will be speaking in French. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'd like to make a correction. I don't work in the oil sector anymore. And I'm pretty much involved in the mining sector. Now, how are the extractive industries contributing to a reform to make local operators more accountable in Madagascar? Well, everything started because of the reconciliation report, which were published. EITI initiatives have been introduced in Madagascar some 10 years ago approximately. And from the report about Madagascar, a series of problems were identified. For instance, the subnational transfers, revenue transfers. I'm take the example of the biggest mining company in the nickel mining. Between 2012 and 2018, the Ambatovi company was supposed to pay a revenue which was the equivalent of $18 million to the local population impacted by the project. Unfortunately, the payment wasn't made because there was no law passed, but there was a law, but the decree was not fit for a fair distribution of this amount, bearing in mind that it's a very high amount of money and of great importance for the local communities. These local communities had only had a budget of $1,000 to $10,000. Now, with this Ambatovi transfer, they have approximately $100,000 a year of a local budget. So this should mean a change for these communes, for these local populations. Another thing which draw the attention of the MSG of EITI is the lack of information as to the impact of project on the environment and on gender balance. Well, in fact, the MSG had started to tackle this problem in 2016, further to the publishing of the reconciliation report. So the objective of our MSG is to improve the situation in these areas. For instance, the leading oil company in Madagascar, called Madagascar Oil, was the first one in disclosing some element. They have worked on the capacity building for women, and have worked to empower women in these communities so that women in these local populations could take part in the public consultation process, which was not possible before that because it were always male who were at the forefront and women didn't have a right to speak out. Same thing for the real estate management. Women in Madagascar, particularly in the very remote areas, do not have access to the land. So it has drawn the attention of the MSG. Further to this facts which were found by the EITI, the MSG has commissioned an investigation on the infranational revenue transfers, and it was noted that for various reasons these payments were delayed. For instance, there were some local communities or villages that didn't have any bank account. Very simple. They couldn't have access to the money, or they were located in too remote areas to have access to these funds. And it was very difficult for the central government to have this flow of money transferred to the local communities. And also, some of them didn't know where the money was coming from. And then, after a series of investigation and studies, the MSG has consolidated these findings and has organized a series of workshops at the national level, but above all at the regional level. And these various workshops have been organized along with some work with other cooperation agencies, like with a Search for Common Grounds or with the German Development Agency to fight violence against women in the extractive sectors. And all these workshops and meetings and work sessions were very promising because it's a long way, but it is still in incipient phase. But the preliminary results are quite promising. A few years back, the stakeholders were not very involved. They were rather passive. Very few citizens would attend the public meetings. And we've noted more recently that citizens and stakeholders were actively taking part in the meetings, and this has been very positive. For instance, it has an impact on the public administration, encouraging the national administration to start a series of reform for the transfers. I'm thinking about the mining registry or the mining cadastre, which reports to the Ministry of Energy and Mining. And since last year, we have had, for the first time online, what would be the amounts to be paid to the various communities, thanks to this registry, because sometimes the mining companies didn't even know to which community these payments were to be made. This cadastre or this registry has helped to raise awareness in the community of stakeholders, leading them to ask very relevant questions. There's been a surge in the number of women representing the stakeholders. Same thing for the stakeholders who are pretty much involved. The civil society is pretty much involved in the dialogue. Another thing that is very encouraging is that the stakeholders have expressed some wishes or even claims, and they're claiming for more workshops, more meetings. They're asking for EITI to be decentralized at the regional level instead of having it only organized at the national level. But there are several challenges Madagascar has to face. First of all, we have infrastructure problems, as has already been referred to earlier by other speakers. Most of the villages that are impacted by the oil or mining projects are in the remotest areas of the country, therefore difficult to access them. There is another problem as to the lack of human resources for the EITI in Madagascar. And there is also a funding problem because those workshops have to be organized at a regional level. So you have to pay for the travel expenses of all those people to go there. The decentralized bodies have to travel to these remote regions, and this involves higher costs. I think that's all I had to say, and time's up for me. So nevertheless, I'd like to say that if we compare the situation 5 years ago and today's, if we were to make a snapshot of the situation today, we are very proud to see that we have more stakeholders involved, and that the work we've done with the civil society really bore fruit. And thanks to EITI and thanks to the National Committee gathering representatives from the government, the civil society and the extractive industries, a genuine dialogue has opened. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very interesting example of how a process has empowered citizens, and citizens have demanded decentralization in very remote areas where the state has high costs to even reach some of those communities. So I'm now going to call on, we have a series of commentators here. We'll start with a comment, perhaps 2 to 3 minutes, not more from each commentator. First, Mr. Paul Barker, who's a representative of civil society in Papua New Guinea. Then I'll call on Dr. Nidhal Abdul Zahra, who will speak in Arabic, so have your headsets ready. Director General of Supreme Audit of Iraq. Can I ask whether Michel Yeboui Kofi Kouadio, coordinator of Publish What You Pay from Côte d'Ivoire, is here? Okay, so finally, it'll be Hélène de Villiers-Piachet, who is from the Responsible Mining Index. So, Paul.
Thank you, Penny. I think certainly I'm with an independent policy think tank in Papua New Guinea, and certainly the comments that I've heard from different speakers from Madagascar, from Peru, from Mongolia ring very true in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is another country with a vast majority of the population living in rural areas, living in very remote areas, and with many of the sort of challenges that you've been highlighting. I really can relate to the idea of use of technology and the fact that, yes, just because people are remote doesn't mean that they are not adaptable to technology and the use of GIS mechanisms. There's a team in Papua New Guinea who've been developing with an NGO, three-dimensional modeling, which they've actually taken to various other countries to show, because it's a mechanism that local communities can relate to very well. So PNG is a resource-rich country where extractives dominate and provide a major portion of the GDP, completely dominate exports, and yet rather surprisingly provide in recent years remarkably little in terms of direct tax revenue. And we've had a lot of experience in the past from a number of major resource projects which did cause problems which will be known about internationally, the Bougainville crisis being one, the Oktedi pollution from the Oktedi River, from the Oktedi mine, more recently from the Ramu nickel with deep sea. And in the future, we've got the whole issue and potential issue of deep sea mining, which seems to be being triggered off. And I will have a question if I'm given an opportunity later to Dr. Müller in relation to that, but we'll come to that. I know you haven't got it in Germany, but the technology is being developed there, and it's an area where certainly people in Papua New Guinea are very interested, concerned, but not just in PNG, all across the Pacific. They're watching what's going to happen, because obviously we're talking about new technology and very limited knowledge. So, as I say, PNG, largely a rural population, rural livelihoods and so on, very challenging sort of getting active awareness and engagement with local communities. But I would say, again, the key lesson, as highlighted by some of the other speakers, is really to engage early, to identify who the resource owners. In Papua New Guinea, nearly all the land belongs to the customary owners, but the mineral and oil and gas resources belong to the state. Tell that to the resource owners, because they tend to think that everything belongs to them, underground, on the surface, and actually above the surface. So the conversation, as some of the other members highlighted, is very challenging, because the issues that they have may be completely different to what the companies and the government have. And so the whole issue of how you actually interact, we obviously have the companies trying to interact, the government institutions trying to interact, but also civil society and trying to work out how it best plays as an intermediary. And again, the communities themselves who organize their own civil society mechanisms for communication. So but again, as rural community members, they're most affected by environmental impacts. So yes, they are, as elsewhere, they're interested in the benefit sharing and so on and so forth, compensation issues if they're forfeiting. But because they're all dependent on the land, obviously whatever happens on the land, often we've had the interactions with the people who are on that patch of land where a resource project is, but obviously the people who are affected are the people who may be downstream and so on. So those are some of the issues, and I think I can see a lot that is shared with their other speakers.
Thank you very much. So the need for early engagement and understanding what are the resources that people live on and how that affects them, not just where they live, but if they're upstream, if they're downstream, etc. And you have a question for our German colleague, Dr. Eder, in a minute. So moving on to Dr. Nidal, please, from Iraq.
Assalamu alaikum. دكتور نضال عبد الزهرة مدير عام في ديوان الرقابة المالية الاتحادي مسؤولة عن تدقيق وزارات النفط والكهرباء والصناعة. العراق.
So the organization that I represent is responsible for the auditing of all the energy sectors. Iraq joined the EITI in 2010, and the initiative really played a key role in the divulgation, but also the exploitation and the use of most data that used to be secret in companies in the Ministry of Oil, other ministries. And so the government was able to use these data and this information for the benefit of Iraqi society, because the sale of oil and the extractive industries in Iraq represents the most important source of revenue for the state budget. The oil revenues account for 80 to 95% of the state budget. And all of this is audited and controlled by an organism by a federal body. And it is a revenue that is a sovereign revenue. It belongs to the government. And in exchange, the Iraqi government pays for those industries. And so these revenues are redistributed in line with the finance law to all of the Iraqi provinces in order to cover all investments and current expenses. When I talk about investment, there is also a budget that is allocated to mitigate the socioeconomic consequences of these exploitations. And however, our country is facing several challenges to redistribute those revenues. Most of those projects have not been fully implemented, namely because of the lack of administrative control. And moreover, most of the provinces that were supposed to receive those budgets did not use those revenues efficiently. And so the Transparency Initiative is currently contributing very efficiently to divulging those financial data and the revenues of these companies and how these revenues can be redistributed in Iraqi society. Most of our provinces use oil revenues to build infrastructure or to improve socioeconomic conditions and environmental conditions. And I would like to add that Iraq has joined the EITI organization for the extractive industries audits. Iraq drafted a report on auditing these type of industries, and that goes to show how important this is to the Iraqi government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that interesting experience. And very quickly, we're moving on to Hélène de Villiers for your comment on what you've heard. And then we will move to questions.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Penny, and to the speakers who all brought such really interesting, real examples. So the few things that stood out for me from your comments and also from our experiences at the Responsible Mining Foundation, where we measure the policies and practices of large-scale mining companies across the ESG spectrum, but also spend a lot of time around the world speaking to mining-affected groups and mining-affected people. And one of the things that stood out from what you said, and I was interested in the German example of sitting down with the MSG and saying what matters for us. I think that's a really important thing because it's often contextual, and it's a really healthy thing for a group to sit down and identify for themselves what matters for us. In terms of sharing the data and making it powerful and having the impacts long-term that we all want to see, one of the other things we think is really important, and I noted it from some of the comments, is that it's really a good idea to sit down and identify the different users. That's something we've run across quite often, where we find, particularly if one's talking in the regions, in countries with mining affected groups, that we've had over and over the request, please simplify. So the word simplify has come back to us with great appreciation for what data we're trying to share, but every time the request is please simplify. And so this brings us to reflect on open data principles, and one of the first ones is access and usability as well. So we think it's really important to distinguish between different users and then make sure that the data is shared in a way that recognizes and respects the different users. The other thing that stood out is the matter of sustainability, the word that comes up so often here. And of course, one uses it with caution in the context of mining. But there is something to be said for thinking about data sharing and thinking about these decisions at MSGs, which we think are a really powerful opportunity in terms of life cycle management of the mining resources and thinking long-term with early planning and thinking ahead, and acknowledging that it's an intergenerational opportunity, so that the spending and the sharing of data should take into account intergenerationality. The last point I would make is that if data is to be successful, shared successfully, and shift the systems, civic space is really precious and important, and all three constituencies should be called on to protect that. Thank you.
And very quickly, before we move to questions, is Michel Yoboué from Côte d'Ivoire. Have you got any comments you'd like to make? Thank you. Are you speaking in French? Yeah. Headsets, please.
Bien, je vais...
I'm going to talk in French. So I'm Dr. Michel Yoboué, and I work for the research advocacy group PWYP. It's a civil society organization that's based in Côte d'Ivoire, and we coordinate the activities of this group. And so I would like to thank you for inviting me here today. And what really struck me was that several speakers made very interesting presentations. Thank you for that. Those presentations were absolutely were very enriching. But I was more interested by the issue of the transmission of information to subnational authorities and the dialogue with the communities that are most affected by the projects. I think that Eduardo Guevara mentioned something that was very interesting to me. I hope I don't butcher your name, but it really attracted my attention because I think it's similar to what happens in Côte d'Ivoire. In Côte d'Ivoire, we have some reforms have been rolled out. We have a new mining code that dates back to 2014, and so there is a fund. A fund has been created. It's a local mining development fund, and this fund is directly allocated. It is directly transmitted to local authorities in order to foster sustainable local development. And so, in order to manage this fund, we have local mining development committees, and they are made up of the representatives of the main local communities of the sites where there is a mining project. So in every site where the area mining project is being carried out, there are representatives of the community, and the communities are responsible for using the resources that are given through the fund in order to launch local projects. But there are two main issues, and I think the Peruvian speaker mentioned that too. Two main issues. The first one is human resources at the local level, because the people who are sitting on the committee don't always have the capacity that is the capacities that are necessary to manage and to launch these projects. Second problem, the problem of reporting, because with the EITI, it is necessary to report on the use of those resources. So more needs to be done in order to achieve a better use of the revenues that are generated by these industries and that are transferred to communities in order to ensure sustainable development. And I would like to ask a question to the Peruvian speaker. When you talk about the improvement of the management of these resources, do you have facilities, local facilities, in order to manage those funds? And do you have initiatives in order to better manage do you have mechanisms that allow those people who manage those funds to better do their work? Thank you.
So before you answer, let's take a round of questions. I know Paul had a question. I don't know whether, okay. And please put up your hands. So Paul, then the gentleman over there, lady over there. Okay. So we'll take Paul to start.
Okay, thank you, Penny. Dr. Müller, sorry, this may be outside your normal realm of experience, but obviously the mining industry is not locked in each country. It's sort of global. And as I mentioned, with deep sea mining, it may be the new frontier. We're being told it's the new frontier. Whether it's a nice frontier, we're not quite so sure. It obviously involves new technology. We sometimes feel that they're exploring the opportunities of deep sea mining in places like the Pacific because, yes, the resources are there and various other functions, but maybe also because governance is relatively weak, the capacity is to oversee is weaker. Clearly, if developing countries and smaller island nations are going to develop the fiscal regimes, but also the safeguards for environmental safe management, if there is safe management, we're going to need a lot of assistance. And the technology, I understand, is particularly focused in Germany. I don't know if it's an area where you and Germany and EITI Germany could work with countries like Papua New Guinea, but all across the Pacific and elsewhere in helping make accessible that science and the technology and the implications. So.
Merci beaucoup. Ma question est...
Thank you very much. My question is for Mrs. Edda as well. You mentioned something that was particularly interesting for us. You talked about subsidies that were transferred to the communities that are affected by the project. What what subsidies are you talking about? Because in most of our countries, states do not give any subsidies. They ask companies to mitigate the negative impact of their exploitations, but the state doesn't undertake these subsidies. So I would like to know more about that. It could be interesting for our countries too.
Thank you. My name is Kosa Muntali from Malawi. I have two questions. Two. The first, I think I would want if there's any experience that you can help to share from the both speakers for those companies that fail to comply in countries where laws are weak and they come, exploit, and they leave. Case in a point for Malawi, we have Paladin, which we have is based in Australia, almost a decade now. They're nowhere to be seen, but they've left a lot of these tailings. They were doing uranium in an open pit form, and it remains a threat to the environment. At the same time, there's Eland Coal Mine with a lot of ditches, which the communities, up to now, there's nothing, and they have also left for almost 10 years. Secondly, it is an issue to do with the commitment from development partners, more especially like World Bank or GIZ. In the event that you commit to support the load maps for different countries, case in a point like for Malawi, suppose if, let's say, you don't commit, you have a load map and you promise to say we are to fund to make sure that you achieve what you want to achieve, then comes 2 years down the line, there are no resources. What can we do to hold like such development partners accountable? Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Louise Knoll. I'm an advisor to mining companies on their relationships with local government and communities. And my question relates to the difficult area of Indigenous human rights and free and prior informed consent. And I'd like to know if EITI have a position on free and prior informed consent, and whether the approach of the EITI being best practice is an opportunity to contribute to improved engagement and or consent processes, in more specifically in the area of extractives.
Thank you very much. So our first question was from Michelle for Peru about, could you explain a bit more about these direct hypothecated fideicomisos funds to village level?
En el caso de los fideicomisos que mencioné,
as regards these trust funds, that is something new we are now using in the framework of some of our contracts. We are observing how it's working. And for oil, we have one contract with trust funds, which so far hasn't worked too well. Apparently, it wasn't properly set up, and therefore, we are now concluding a new contract where we try to improve this so that it can be managed better. One of the problems was that there were 20 communities included in that oil project, and it was decided that each of them would have a representative within the trust fund for decision-making, which caused a number of problems, organizational and management problems, and also organizational problems at the level of the communities, because they have to get organized, and it would be better if they had 2 or 3 representatives for them all with the board of these funds. But the idea is important, and we need resources for that, and they are being made available to the communities, but we have to continue improving this so that it works more efficiently. And we won't have any more the problems that we've had, but which we recognize.
Yeah, so that's the design of your special dedicated village funds is important, and then the representation and access on the community side. There were 2 questions for you, Dr. Era. One from Paul about does Germany have expertise in the deep sea mining technologies which are starting to be demanded, and is there a role for EITI Germany to help inform and guide other countries in that? And then another question about the subsidies. What are these subsidies? What kind of subsidies? From whom to whom? When in other countries it was said that governments are not really subsidizing companies. So a bit more explanation on that.
The first question, thank you very much. I'm sure that my colleagues in the MSG coming from companies would be highly, let's say, prepared to answer your question in a very concrete way. We are, and this is, I would say, the entire logic of our work. We have 2 intentions when we look into this entire sector. One is what we are doing in our own domestically, but secondly, Germany is a country where we have a high import on raw materials, but because we are not very rich in natural resources. So first one, we are very much interested in transfer of technology, certainly, and the Ministry of Economic Cooperation is part of the entire exercise. In Germany, it's Ministry of Economic Affairs, but also those who are in the economic collaboration and cooperation issue. They are very much engaged there, and they support EITI for many, many years, even before we started our own reporting. So I'm sure that we have a lot of projects. I'm not prepared to answer your question, but I'm sure that there are already now these kind of projects from Germany and from support countries, from companies and from experts in this field. So yes, and we had many years, and I would say when I listened to these very interesting comments or reports from the different countries, I saw that some countries are starting now, let's say in last years. We have 150 years, I think, of industrialization. And so we developed this technology. And the technology is now more sophisticated, I would say, because it was needed in our country. It's efficiency, which plays a big role. It's environmental, to be safe concerning environmental impact. And also, these are the social conditions for workers, how you let's say, people who go into these mines. So that's why I mentioned the unions, labor union, the trade unions here. And I think it's very important. I'm sure that in the development of our technology, the role and impact of our trade unions played a major role, because the workers had to be protected and they had to do this job. But I'm really interested to bring you together with some of our expertise. Subsidies. There are different forms of subsidies depending on the objective. So I talked about subsidies in the energy sector, hard coal. This is money going from the general budget, from the state, to certain, let's say, those who are benefiting from this money. In the beginning, when we tried to let's say to organize the process of phasing out hard coal, it was first kind of subsidy helping the still existing hard coal mining to be competitive with very cheap hard coal which was imported, so that they could continue. And we reduced hard coal mining step by step, and in line with subsidies, it was a kind of adaptation stream or process. And secondly, it is mainly, it's always social conditions to help the workers to not to come into unemployment and so. And the others, we have the same subsidies, for instance, when you now go for in our program to help to develop renewable energies, because they have to come into the market and have kept them conditions. It's sure not to come into legal problems, that this is all decided and negotiated with the European Union. So we can only do that without distortion and problems in the international market and the competition system. So it has to normally it needs let's say, an objective which is not purely economic, but it is for instance, to help climate change developments, or to help the adaptation of employment to a new technology.
Thank you. We had a question about do any of the panelists have any advice for how you can call companies to account in countries where the law's weak? Maybe the companies have finished their projects and they've got tailing and residuals there, and there should be cleanup, but there's no way within the country to call them to account for that cleanup. So I don't know if anyone, perhaps international colleagues, want to respond, and if they don't, I can. But the other question then is to kind of bank partners, IFC and Inter-American Development Bank. If I understood the question correctly, it was how can we call bank partners to account when it seems that you've committed funds, there's investment funds to help work on projects in this area, and then either the project ends or it doesn't manifest, and then there aren't the resources for the government to really work for a more sustainable and socially sustainable, environmentally sustainable sector. So what is the process then for investors, if you like, to also be called to account? So I don't know if either of you want to... Okay, IFC will take...
Okay. Thank you. So IFC has very clear standard on the bank invested mining companies should follow that standard to ensure the sustainability and environmental standards. So this mechanism ensures the local community to engage with company and to solve the problems. And just one example that on the water management, mining and water management, the IFC in Mongolia initiated this roundtable. It's led by industry people, and they signed for voluntary code of principles on water management, and they included the participatory monitoring on this water, how mining companies are using the water and how they are measuring the balances and whether they are polluted or not. And there's a lots of high standards. So and Mongolia's 10 big companies are signed voluntarily those principles and implements this standard and then communicate what have done. So there's a Mongolian case.
Thank you. And I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time. So there is one more question. And I thought since I should be handing over to the EITI Secretariat to say a last few final words, that this last question is to the EITI Secretariat. Can you respond about whether the standard and the Secretariat and the national members of EITI or MSGs of EITI are taking into account the international law which relates to mandatory allowing processes of free, prior and informed consent for indigenous and traditional peoples who have long-standing relationship with their natural resources. So over to you, EITI, and I think then we close.
Thank you very much, Penny. My name is Indra Tevo. I work at the International Secretariat on policy issues and implementation in our Central African countries. Thank you very much for your question, and it's an excellent one. And I mean, please, if our panelists from Latin America do want to compliment, don't hesitate. There is no explicit mention of free, prior, informed consent in the EITI standard. So that is a very clear question. There is no, let's say, guideline in our standard when it comes to that. However, we do have very clear commitments on behalf of our supporting companies at the international level, and I mean, we can discuss this later, but they're some of the largest companies in the world in there, and we do want our supporting companies to be held at the highest possible standards. So obviously, these would be discussions that would be taking place at the national level too, within multi-stakeholder groups. They should be able to be, for example, civil society organizations and multi-stakeholder groups should be able to put that issue on the table if they think that one of the companies operating in the country, especially if it's affiliated to one of our supporting companies, whether it's a subsidiary of a company operating at the international level, they should be able to put that issue on the table, absolutely. And this is not something that we would be very happy with at not the International Secretariat level, but the International Board of the EITI level. I don't know if you want to add something or... No. Yes.
In Peru? Well, there are two issues in Peru. First of all, there's mining, specifically where when mines close, as soon as the mine starts to function, there is a closing program which clearly states what will be done to remedy and correct anything that has been done. And we have a fund that is established from the beginning for this closing. And what usually happens is that the state usually decides to pay for the fund. And with the fund and the closing plan, the government carries out the closure. Sometimes the government has to add to this fund, but can also turn to the company and ask them to cover this extra spending. But this would be something that the local branch would pay, and reaching the ultimate parent company is very different. But oil and gas is different. For oil and gas, we have contracts where even though the local subsidiary or branch of the multinational is involved, the ultimate parent company has to endorse or clear the local subsidiary and provide a corporate guarantee to ensure that, on the one hand, they will fulfill the minimum requirements for the investment in the exploration phase, and some of the corporate safeguards that are issued at that point also entail covering all of the environmental impacts. So, in a sense, that does allow us to go all the way up to the ultimate parent company through the corporate safeguards. There's another formula that we haven't used yet and that could be further analyzed, and it has to do with having insurance policies. And in some of the other countries we've been looking into, they have these policies and the insurance kicks in so that the state can access the funds and use them for remedy.
We're very happy to have you on our new EITI board. Just to conclude, and thank you so much again, Penny, and thank you to all the panelists. There's a lot of work that has gone into the preparation of this session. Thank you to the commentators and to the audience for being here. What I just want to highlight is that at the EITI International Secretariat and at the EITI board level, we're very keen in encouraging peer learning experiences like this one, but also in country at the regional level when it comes to all the thematics that we've been touching upon today. So revenue allocation at the subnational level, revenue management, environmental impact, gender, and all the thematics that we've been talking about today. That means in light of the new standard, of the 2019 standard, updating our guidance to our countries, encouraging peer learning, and of course making sure that the data that is being disclosed through EITI national processes does respond to specific data needs, as all of our panelists have really highlighted really well. Last information, the next plenary session is at 4:15, and we'll be talking about anti-corruption, the role of the EITI that can play in anti-corruption, and that's going to be a fascinating session. Let's please join me in applauding our panelists. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure and my great honor to welcome you to this plenary session, which aims to discuss the importance of transparency in addressing corruption in the extractive industry, and of course the role that the EITI plays in this endeavor. We all know that the extractive sector is particularly susceptible to corruption risk. We have a lot of signals to this end. According to our OECD 2014 foreign bribery report, we know that 1 case of transnational corruption out of 5 occurs in the extractive sector. We also, if we look at the US data on enforcement actions under the US FCPA, Foreign Corruption Practices Act, we know that 20% of the 242 actions that have been taken are linked to the extractive industry. We have seen also in the recent scandals, the Panama Papers, the Lava Jato in Brazil, that a lot of actors from this sector were implicated in these scandals. We have also at the OECD a typology of corruption risks in the extractive value chain, and in this work has shown that commodity trading and involvement of state-owned enterprises are, rising corruption risks. We have done last year at the OECD a survey regarding state-owned enterprises, surveying both CEOs and board members of state-owned enterprises globally. And the results of this survey are quite sobering, because 42% of the people surveyed say that they have witnessed corruption acts or illegal practices in their activities in recent years. But the numbers were even higher for the extractive industry, for oil, gas, and mining. So we have all these very clear signals that the sector is prone to corruption. So there's a lot of work, but I'm sure you don't learn anything here. And of course, the consequences are very severe for the countries concerned. At the OECD, we have been working on these issues for more than 30 years, partnering with our member governments and beyond, other governments, obviously, with business, also with the civil society to combat corruption and promote integrity. We are very proud of our partnership with the EITI, as you have heard from the Secretary General this morning. And we work with the EITI, including to promote responsible mineral supply chains and artisanal and small-scale mining. We also work on strengthening the integrity of the state-owned enterprises. And you might know also that 1 month ago, the OECD has adopted in its ministerial meeting new guidelines for integrity of state-owned enterprises. We work also on fighting illicit financial flows by promoting tax transparency and effective domestic resource mobilization. So to tackle corruption, global standards like the ones that we have at the OECD and initiatives such as the EITI, they put emphasis on the importance of transparency. But the question remains, to what extent is transparency effective and sufficient in tackling corruption? It's a foundation. We have heard this morning in the plenary session. It's definitely a foundation, but it might not be, it's necessary, but we need some other levers. And we would like also in this session to discuss and to better understand the real-life impact transparency initiatives like the one of the EITI are having to mitigate corruption risks in the extractive sector. And we will discuss that looking at the different responsibilities of the stakeholders, the governments, the business, and civil society. So before, with further ado, I will introduce the speakers. As you can see, we have a very large panel of very distinguished, knowledgeable, competent experts. So I will have to be strict on the time. It's not easy with vice presidents and ministers, but I do my best. And we are very delighted to have in this panel the Vice President of Ghana that should have been on the opening panel this morning, but because of Paris traffic could not join us on time. So we have the honor to have you on this panel. And yes, thank you. Thanks for welcoming him. You have been the Vice President of Ghana for 2 years now, and I would like to ask you this question. Ghana has been at the forefront of extractive transparency recently, particularly on contract transparency and beneficial ownership transparency. So what has been the impact of this transparency in Ghana, and how does it relate to further anti-corruption efforts that you are heading in Ghana?
Thank you very much. I think Ghana has been part of the EITI since 2003. And from what EITI Ghana has been doing, there's been a lot of efforts towards embedding transparency in natural resource governance. So we've been seeing changes in the policy and legal framework incrementally, and more recently you've had the passage of the Right to Information Bill into an act which will seek to, really embed transparency in the governance of the country as a whole, but also in the natural resource sector. The Petroleum Exploration and Development Act, which has also been passed, makes it a requirement for declaration of beneficial ownership and also for open and transparent bidding for oil blocks, for example. So when you look at the architecture that Ghana has put in place, and it's not only in these few cases, you have issues that relate to the mining sector and the transparency in the sector, the fact that we sort of taxing on a basis, depreciating on a fixed rather than reducing balance method, and all of that. Plugging the loopholes for tax evasion and so on in a very transparent manner. We believe that all these things that we have been doing in Ghana to enhance transparency have really improved not only our revenue take, but also in terms of the atmosphere that surrounds the discussion of natural resource governance in Ghana, the host communities where a lot of these activities are taking place. They know that the policymakers are being held to account, and we are taking decisions that will inure to their benefit. And so when you track expenditures and so on, and allocations from the natural resource, and the reports are written every year and so on, there's a good feel in the country that policymakers are being held accountable for the use of the natural resources. Of course, I think that this is only a work in progress. There are many vested interests in the natural resource space, and many interests that are against transparency. I said some time ago that when you are fighting corruption, it's like you are fighting demons and principalities. So you never should take it for granted that you have killed the beast, because it keeps popping up. And the sort of reforms that we try to make, people always try to reverse and so on. So you always have to keep up. And I think that being in the context of EITI, when you have a global network of partner countries that you can encourage each other, that you can peer review each other, really helps in that process. So from Ghana's perspective, I think that EITI has really aided our legal framework. It's aided us in strengthening our institutions, and it has really brought a lot of public trust in the management of natural resources. But it continues to be a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have had already very important message in terms of to fight corruption, you need to tackle many things at the same time. You need to break silos and work across a number of issues, and then you need to be very consistent and do it again and do it again and again and keep at it. So thank you very much for these very clear messages. And now I would like to give the floor to Honourable John Penrose, Minister and Anti-Corruption Champion from the UK. We have been working a lot with the UK. Lately, you have been supporting the OECD anti-corruption strategy, and we are very grateful for that. And also, I mean, the UK has been championing the issue of beneficial ownership transparency. And as we all know, by next year, all the EITI countries will have to ensure that the companies that apply for or hold a participating interest in an oil or gas and mining license or contract, they need to disclose their beneficial owners. So that's a big agenda, big priority for the UK. So could you tell us a bit more about why you think it's a priority and what it brings to this anti-corruption fight?
Very gladly indeed. And I should probably start with a huge vote of thanks to EITI, because you have established the principle of beneficial ownership transparency in the extractive sector first and foremost. And the UK is really trying to build on the foundations that you have laid, because what we realized is that the benefits of beneficial ownership transparency go much, much further than just the extractive sector. They're very significant in extractives. Clearly, they make a big difference here, but they can apply much, much more broadly. So, for example, if you identify some money that has been stolen or abstracted from an extractives transaction, and it then gets whisked abroad. It gets taken and bounced through 15 different countries, through different shell companies, through trusts, and is eventually used to invest in, let's say, a luxury penthouse apartment in London or in Manhattan or in Vancouver, or it doesn't matter where. You need to be able to follow the money. And if you can follow the money, then your reach is enormously extended and expanded, so that you can find where that money's got to, and if it's been stolen from Ghana or from Nigeria, or it doesn't matter from where, you can go and get it back. You can repatriate it to your country where it belongs, where it should have been all the time, and you can also have an audit trail which you can use in court to take down the people who were responsible for stealing it in the first place and then moving it around the world as well. So it's an incredibly powerful idea that deserves much, much broader application than just extractives. And so we're very excited by it, particularly because Britain holds, is host to one of the two largest financial centres on the planet. And that means that an awful lot of the money, which rotates through legitimate business, and a very small percentage of it, which of course will be dirty money, washes through financial centres like the City of London, like New York. And so we know that we have an interest in this too. We have a dog in this fight. We need to make sure that we are part of the solution rather than contributing to the problem. So we think that EITI has done an amazingly important job establishing this principle. We would like to take it much more broadly. And the advantage, ladies and gentlemen, is if your country is involved in introducing one of these beneficial ownership registers, open ones, it's incredibly cheap. It's one of the most efficient and effective ways of turbocharging your economy and fighting corruption that you can possibly do, pound for pound, almost anything else you can think of. So it's really worthwhile. And what we're doing here is trying to gather more people to the banner of extending these ideas, extending an open beneficial ownership register so that you can see who owns what in your country, and you can work out whether or not it's been bought with dirty money, and if it has, get it back.
Thank you very much. It's a very passionate message towards establishing this transparency about beneficial ownership. And yes, indeed, it might be used for many other purposes than only in the extractive sector, and it's quite powerful in allowing enforcement. And I would like to ask you a second question, because you have also introduced in the UK some new innovative mechanism with these unexplained wealth orders. Could you tell us a little bit about it, and how does it work, and how it serves to decrease incentives for corruption, maybe?
Yes, it's still fairly early days. We introduced this several months ago now, and it started working. We've got a number of initial cases so far, but broadly speaking, an unexplained wealth order says, we think that so-and-so who is holding down a perfectly normal job but seems to be living the life of a millionaire has an awful lot of money that no one can tell where it came from. and we'd like you please to explain where it came from. So it is not saying you are guilty, it's just saying we are investigating, and please we would like you to show that your money has been honestly earned. So it requires people to show that their money is honestly earned, and if it is, then there's no problem and it goes no further. But if it's not, then it puts them under pressure to account for the fact that they are being paid a lower middle class wage and yet living like a millionaire in a flat in Chelsea, and how can that be? So at the moment it is proving very effective as an investigative tool, and it is forcing some people who would rather not have a light shone into their personal finances to come clean.
Thank you very much. So we have new instruments and new tactics to reveal corruption through beneficial ownership or through these specific mechanisms. Thank you very much. Now I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Owasanawe from Nigeria. You're the Executive Chairman of the Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission in Nigeria, and you have been also the Executive Secretary of the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption in Nigeria. So could you tell us a little bit about, may I first quote you, because you said, related to a recent scandal in your country, that when funds meant for security and health are diverted by corruption into private pockets, the entire nation suffers. So could you tell us a little bit about your anti-corruption agenda and how the EITI complements this agenda and helps you to have more impact?
Thank you very much. Let me join the others in thanking EITI for providing this platform for a conversation. Let me start by first noting that the whole initiative about beneficial ownership disclosures is innovative and radical. But when we talk about beneficial ownership, I think there's this tendency to focus only on perhaps profit-making companies. But the advocacy from very early on should extend to charities and to trusts. Because charities and trusts are used as vehicles for corruption. And I don't want us to get fixated so early on in the conversation that we're talking about limited liability companies or public companies where at the end of the year investors expect a dividend. Because we know that not-for-profits have been used to launder money, and we need to put that on the radar right from the beginning. Right now, from what I see of the conversation, there seems to be a fixation on these profit-earning corporations. Having said that, I want to say that the EITI process, and especially the role that the Nigerian Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative has played, has been extremely useful and beneficial. I think the first thing that it does is that it brings openness to the entire transaction. When you are working in the dark, progress is very slow, and you are more accident-prone than when there is light thrown into everything. So the first thing is with information. And I think that Nigeria's Nigeria joined the EITI process in 2003 and followed up with a legal framework which strengthened the Nigerian arm in 2007. And since then, they've come up with a lot of agenda setting and road mapping reports, you know, to give both the civil society, even the private sector, and government. There are parts of government who are not even aware of exactly what is going on in the extractive industry. I mean, if you get elected as a president or a vice president today, you have to rely on what you're told by the people who are the key civil servants or players in the market. And if they choose to hoodwink you, you remain hoodwinked until further notice. So I think that one of the great things that the initiative has brought is transparency and the information. First of all, the audit reports that NEITI has put out in the past few years has opened up the space with regard to revenues, who is getting what, who is losing what, and what are we losing in terms of the extractives, who is dodging tax, and how much potentially are we losing, that we're bleeding virtually. And so that's the first thing that you need, information. When you have information, then you can begin to take action to deal with it. With regard to what's the agenda, I think I just assumed office a few months ago, and one of the things that I found as chair of a law enforcement agency is that we had not proactively worked together to say, from these findings, what can we do next? Okay? Of course, you cannot tackle all of the things that you find at the same time. You neither have the budget, the manpower, okay, nor the infrastructure to deal with it. But you can at least set an agenda and say, this is where I'm going to start from. I'm going to start with the low-hanging fruits, begin to block the leakages and stop the bleeding. So that if you stop the bleeding gradually, working with other stakeholders, you can begin to make progress and earn more revenue that will help you to meet your own sustainable development goals.
Thank you very much. So it's really like good advice for all the enforcers, which is a very challenging job in this area, and the issue of prioritizing. Where do you tackle first your first cases, and what do you look at first? Now I would like to give the floor to Alexandra Gillis. She's an advisor in the Natural Resource Governance Institute, an expert on oil sector corruption, and she has an upcoming book on crude intentions, how oil sector corruption contaminates the world. So maybe you could give us a little bit of a preview of your book and your main messages. And you are also working on a discussion paper about the role of EITI in fighting corruption. So could you help us better understand where the EITI has addressed real-world corruption risks?
Sure, thank you very much, and it's an honor to be on this panel. I've spent the last couple of months working with the International Secretariat and thinking through this question of what is the EITI's role in addressing corruption and what can be done more in the future. And to share a few ideas, I mean, the EITI has some real unique strengths when it comes to fighting corruption. One is that it's shining a light in the right place. If you were to map the corruption risks in the extractive sector, the EITI standard addresses many of those parts of the sector. So how exploration and production licenses are allocated, what terms are negotiated in the contracts, SOE finances and how SOEs are spending their money, different payment issues, commodity trading is obviously an important one, beneficial ownership, who's actually behind these companies. A number of parts of the EITI standard were added because of corruption considerations. And so the EITI is producing very relevant information. One quick exception that I would mention is the issue of subcontracting or service contracting. If you look at 40 recent cases pursued under the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the oil sector, 30 out of 40 involved service companies. But I wonder how many service companies are in the room right now. And we haven't done a good job of the EITI of incorporating those players and asking what kinds of transparency is needed. So because the EITI reports address a lot of the right issues, they are quite useful to anti-corruption actors, such as bodies like the ICPC, law enforcement agencies, investigative journalists, NGOs, and in a few different ways. Sometimes EITI reports have exposed suspicious transactions. There's a few Global Witness reports that drew data from EITI reports. And that's very important. And as I think beneficial ownership reporting gets going, that will happen more often. But we need to kind of manage expectations here. The EITI aims for a very systemic form of transparency, and that's fantastic. But it means that EITI reports are very different than forensic audits or law enforcement investigations, leaks, whistleblower reports, the kinds of transparency that do more often reveal cases of corruption. But the EITI reports can provide really useful context to anti-corruption actors about how the sector works when they're doing investigations there. Also, when scandals do arise, and they will keep arising, the EITI reports help there to be a more evidence-based, factual discussion about what happened and where can we go from here. Now, these different uses will only take place if there is interaction between the EITI and different anti-corruption actors. So at the country level, like NATI and ICPC, these interactions sound very promising, but at the global level as well, and that's another kind of area for improvement. Another huge strength of the EITI in fighting corruption, and I think a very unique one, is identifying governance practices at the country level that are very vulnerable to abuse. And I can give a couple examples. In Papua New Guinea's first EITI report, they stated that there are 27 extractive sector revenue streams, and only 2 of them were being recorded in the national budget. Now, there may or may not be corruption happening there, I have no idea. But just identifying that governance situation, there is the vulnerability for abuse there. There are some concerns. That's a huge win that the EITI report revealed that. In Myanmar, the EITI commissioned a report that found 60 to 80% of gemstones are not declared, and so they're operating outside the system. Again, the EITI is identifying the kinds of process challenges that are very country-specific, but if they're fixed, corruption risks go down. So again, this dynamic, it's happening in countries around the world, but it could be encouraged in a more deliberate way by all of us and the EITI. So those are some areas where the EITI is making a difference. Just to be balanced, I want to flag one limitation as well. And this is the challenge of, which some people call whitewashing. Some actors in the past have highlighted their participation in the EITI as evidence that they're fighting corruption without actually fighting corruption, or exaggerating the kind of anti-corruption impact that the EITI can have. And this challenge, we've seen it with companies, we've seen it with government officials, we've seen it with international organizations, international financial institutions, and it's an important one to address, and I think that it can be brought under control if we are more clear about what the EITI can and cannot do when it comes to fighting corruption. But in general, just to sum up, I think there are some really exciting opportunities for all of us in this room and the EITI to be more direct in talking about corruption. It is part of the extractive sector. EITI member governments and companies, many of them have confronted it within their ranks. This is the reality that we need to kind of tackle head on. When corruption cases arise, other actors will investigate whether laws were broken, whether criminal wrongdoing occurred. That's not the EITI's job. But at the country and the global level, the EITI can bring together stakeholders and say, okay, what can we learn from these corruption controversies? And how can we go forward and make sure that the same mistakes aren't repeated again in the country where they happened, or more broadly across resource-rich countries? Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's good advice for EITI, but not only for EITI. So now I would like to go to the private sector and ask Paul McDade. You're the CEO of Tullow Oil. You have been in the board of Tullow Oil for since 2006. So you have a long experience. You are working primarily in Africa. And could you tell us how you do think EITI and companies could do better to working together to fight corruption at local or national level? And also, from your perspective, do the current EITI reporting framework and mechanisms address your priorities, business priorities, in the fight against corruption?
Okay, thank you. Maybe first of all say that Tullow Oil's been involved with EITI, I think for almost a decade. And I think we found it, I'll come into a bit more detail, but we found it as a core part of building a zero tolerance reputation across Africa, where the majority of our work is. So it's been a great partnership, and it's been a great assistance to us as we set out our stall and think about how we want to do business in Africa. Maybe just kind of in terms of putting in perspective for us as a company and how we think, recently we just set out a vision for the company looking forward to 2030, and one of the 4 key pillars of that vision is sustainability. Maybe you'd expect that. And how do we think about sustainability? Well, we think of it as kind of 4 components. One is shared prosperity, then responsible operations, governance, inequality, and then environmental stewardship. And the reason I say that is that actually we've got to think about transparency broadly, because I do think transparency has a key part to play across that whole pillar, all 4 aspects of the pillar. You know, we have a big agenda as a company, and we have had it for over a decade now, of shared prosperity. It's a label we attach and we work hard to deliver against. And we found transparency to be a key element of being successful in the delivery. And as I look forward across sustainability, you know, whilst we will continue to focus on shared prosperity, actually environmental stewardship is going to be a key element as we look forward. And I think transparency and potentially EITI have a big part to play in that agenda as well. Has EITI and the relationship with Tullow had a positive impact? Well, the challenge is with things like corruption, you're trying to avoid it, so therefore when you avoid it, it's difficult to measure what you're avoiding. But we truly believe that it has. I say it's been a vital aspect, transparency and working with EIT has been a vital aspect of our shared prosperity. You know, one of the key components of what we do in countries, a lot of people focus on some of the social projects that we do, but actually the fiscal revenues and the ownerships through national company involvement is actually the main benefit that we bring to countries, and therefore having transparency around that is absolutely key. I'd say that, you know, the lifeblood of an independent E&P company is new licenses, new exploration licenses. In our case, that's mainly in Africa, but also South America. And we think, you know, transparency makes for an even playing field as we apply for and try and compete for those licenses. I can name a couple of examples. We've been involved recently in the Ghana bid round, which has been run in that manner, as you would absolutely expect. Recently in South America, Argentina had a great example of a very transparent and public bid round. And that's what we want as a private company. We want to be able to compete on an even playing field. And we have seen areas where we were definitely in the running. We thought we're about to be awarded license, and suddenly we find that we're not, you know, and we wonder why. So again, transparency in that lifeblood of the bidding round of extractives is absolutely key. You know, again, building this reputation across Africa for our part of zero tolerance is really important. We find as we go from country to country in the continent, and we're involved in many countries in the continent, that often we find our reputation precedes us and arrives before we do. And that's really helpful, because when you have a reputation of zero tolerance, actually what you find is the counterparts that want to come and work with you are almost self-selecting. So we tend to, it actually is a positive move forward that people who want to go ahead in a manner that is not the sort of governance that we want to be involved in, actually we find they tend to keep away from us because of our reputation. So I think this relationship with EITI, it's provided a kind of common and credible basis so that we can work with the governments where we operate. It's not about what Tullow think, or it's actually it gives that relationship between oil company and government a framework in which we can work together and support each other in anti-corruption and good governance. You know, in Ghana, where we work extensively, Côte d'Ivoire, where we work extensively, we've used that. And often in a number of countries that we're just starting to operate in Guyana, in Suriname, in Argentina, and in Peru, you know, again, we found their relationship with EITI very helpful as we move forward and work with them around our licenses. So we believe that already we're working well together. Looking forward, we very much applaud EITI's decision to require the publication of contracts following from 2021. And again, we will actively, and I think many of our counterparts in the industry will actively support that ambition. as well as supporting the ambition to publish the contracts before 2021 as well, as many countries have done. I think, unfortunately, we still see many examples where great transparency does not lead to great accountability. And I think that's an area as we look forward with EITI. How do we get a better connection between all the hard work that's going into transparency and then redirect that towards driving really true accountability? I think there's something about the information. You know, we work in a complex industry. Some of the information can be quite complex. How do we simplify it so that civil society can actually read these reports, understand them, and understand what the reports are telling them? And again, also accessibility to data is important as well. And a number of people, again, Rio Tinto chairman this morning and many in the panel have talked about beneficial interests. I think that's very important looking forward. I think supply chain, you mentioned supply chain, absolutely. You know, this is an area which is critical. Internally within our company, our main focus on our code of conduct and ethics is around supply chain. That's where we see our biggest risk, is not the relationship between us and country. It's actually the main risk we see is between our supply chain. And our supply chain is deep. Many times we have contractors who have subcontractors who have subcontractors, and trying to ensure a clean chain all the way down the supply. So I think that is an area where we could benefit from EITI looking more deeply. And then finally, just the mention of environment. I think I've been at a number of sessions recently where the session was about ESG, and I found the session hijacked by climate. And I think that is an indication of how important environment and stewardship and climate is going to become over the next decade. And certainly within our company, one of the reasons for looking again at our sustainability pillar is we feel that that is going to be something that is so important for our industry in the future. Therefore, I think it would be really helpful if that was an area that EITI were willing to work with the companies on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a lot for the agenda going forward, and your point especially on how to go from transparency to accountability and what needs to be done very concretely, practically, to make sure that all this information that is disclosed is used towards fighting corruption. So thank you very much for that. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Alexandre Vidigal de Oliveira. He's the Secretary of Geology, Mining and Mining Transformation from Brazil. I will speak in Portuguese, so we have translation from Portuguese also for ones of you who need that. And I think we have all heard about the big Lava Jato case in Brazil. Would like to ask you what have been the lessons drawn from your government from this case, and how do you think the work that you do with EITI could help and complement your efforts and the fight against corruption in your specific context?
Boa tarde a todos.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking all the panelists and the welcome that we've been granted every time you bring up these issues. Brazil will be present. Brazil will be there not just to learn, but also to bring to bear our long-standing experience, to be able to share experiences with other countries, to be able to share what we've done to fight against corruption. Now, the first thing that I'd like to highlight in regard to the positive aspects that we can bring forward in events like these is that corruption means that you have to instate not just one single tool, but a whole series of different tools to be able to tackle all aspects, both prevention and how you react to acts of corruption. And the experience that we have with the car wash scandal was made or led to an important legislative reform in our country. That meant that responsibility was brought to bear on legal persons as well, on companies. So it brought them out of their comfort zone. In Brazil, we had a legislative framework with very effective measures to be able to sanction and punish those who were found guilty of bribery, of corruption. But in terms of corruption, you have to bear in mind both active and passive bribery. And in that context, some were left undealt with. And so what we decided to do in Brazil was overhaul our legislation. We've got quite modern legislation now, and we've managed to ensure that we can sanction both physical persons and legal persons. So a shareholder, an investor who was guilty or had taken part in a bribery to ensure that their company would benefit from corruption. Well, as of 2013, they are fully responsible. Companies, as legal persons, have to answer for all their representatives. And so as of that date, they were fully made aware of the risks that they would be open to if found guilty of corruption. In terms of sanctions, the current sanctions that we instate for devious companies in Brazil needed to be increased. And so we had to ensure that those misdemeanors, those crimes, were no longer tolerated, that we would apply zero tolerance to these crimes. And so alongside this, we also developed a number of leniency programs such that companies that have pinpointed any kind of corruption, any act of bribery, could come forward and find their sentence reduced through that leniency program. Obviously, that's based on voluntary disclosure by the company. And the public servant who receives a bribe or the person in a company who receives a bribe also had the opportunity to be able to apply for leniency. And that was put forward through various programs that we have. And it's something where we really try and instigate confessions for reducing sentences, notably, if they've come forward once again. And so you can only tackle corruption through multiple measures. You can't have one single solution. For example, transparency of data. Transparency of data is also something that Brazil took on. And this was done since 2011. It was essential at that point to ensure that we had disclosure of of information so that we could continue with sentencing. But in that context, it's essential as well to have or to ensure a possibility for whistleblowers to come forward to complement transparency of data as well. And aside from data transparency, aside from providing a hotline for whistleblowing, you also have to have a strong judicial system to be able to react, to be able to sanction when crimes are detected. It's essential to ensure a tie-in between these different approaches. If you just take these approaches in isolation, well, we wouldn't have made any headway in terms of fighting against corruption in Brazil. Now, unfortunately, corruption is a monster of a crime, and this is something where you can feel that when things have moved forward, when you have a way of fighting corruption, you can just lie back and do nothing, as though reducing corruption was enough. And the size and the very proportion of the problem in our country meant that we had to ensure a multi-pronged approach. We have the car wash scandal in Brazil. But this car wash, the lava-jato, if you like, is a barometer of how to tackle all the other types of as yet undetected acts of corruption, from the tiniest to the most scandalous to the biggest. And in that context, to be able to fight effectively against corruption, and again, we have the example of lava-jato, it's essential that you change behaviors, you go through cultural practices, you try to dig out these misdemeanors, these misbehaviors within society. And you always have different types of ways of doing in different cultures, but you have to ensure that you be able to pinpoint misdemeanors right at the beginning so that society can be convinced of the need to fight against corruption. And so lava-jato in reality was dealt with by a whole series of different actions. People can think, well, there's so much corruption in Brazil, and so how did Brazil manage to fight against corruption? And indeed, you can also look at misinformation in relation to corruption. So in that context, it's essential to have a visibility to ensure that we raise the profile of what's